and you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
RT has a piece, as an African country kicks out French influence operations, Macron blames Russian disinformation. Mali has banned Paris-backed NGOs after almost a decade of unsuccessful French attempts to gain a foothold. What are we to make of this? Well, for insight, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of Anti-Fascism. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me. And by the way, it's the roots of U.S. fascism. We could only hope it was the roots of anti-fascism.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Jim Crow and the roots of American fascism. Dr. Gerald Horne, thank you for that correction. Before we get to the story about France and Mali, the New York Times reports major news outlets urge U.S. to drop its charges against Assange. In a joint letter, news organizations warned that the indictment of Assange, quote, sets a dangerous precedent, end quote, that could chill reporting about matters of national security. In a joint open letter, the Times, The Guardian, Le Monde, Der Spiegel, and El País said the prosecution of Assange under the Espionage Act, quote, sets a dangerous precedent, end quote, that threatened to undermine the First Amendment and the freedom of the press. Dr. Horne, your thoughts, and is this too little, too late?
It may be too little, too late, but let's hope that it is not. Listeners may recall Julian Assange, the man of Australian descent, who in a blockbuster a few years ago released documents through a website, WikiLeaks, that were quite negative, to put it euphemistically, towards actions of the United States government in various military theaters. I think that the Times in particular has stepped up because from a certain point of view, Julian Assange was just a publisher. That is to say, he was in the position of A.O. Sulzberger, the publisher of the New York Times, which, by the way, its milk and meat is receiving documents, oftentimes unacknowledged, from various U.S. government sources, and then turning them into stories, or in the case of the Pentagon Papers, sort of printing them with few redactions. And so I think that Mr. Sulzberger of the New York Times finally awakened to the realistic possibility that by throwing Julian Assange in jail, that he is helping to establish a precedent whereby he could be thrown in jail for releasing U.S. government documents from an unacknowledged source. So all we can say is better late than never, but as you suggested at the top, it may be too little too late.
Moving on to Africa, RT reports as an African country kicks out French influence operations, Macron blames Russian disinformation. Mali has banned Paris-backed NGOs after almost a decade of unsuccessful French attempts to gain a foothold. Dr. Horne.
Well, I think that Mr. Macron is a bit confused. And by the way, I don't think that that confusion will be alleviated by his trip to Washington this week, where he will be the recipient of the first state dinner held by Mr. Biden. I think that will only add to his confusion. I think Mr. Macron needs to realize that one of the reasons for the poor relations, to put it mildly, between Mali and other West African nations and Paris is because of the gross exploitation of France over the decades, in some cases over the centuries. And I think that West African nations have finally said enough. But Mr. Macron, of course, he does not want to acknowledge that he and those who sat in the Élysée Palace are largely responsible for this dismal state of affairs. And so, with the time-honored, time-tested president, he points the finger of accusation at Moscow, not realizing that there are at least three fingers pointing back at Paris. The quicker Mr. Macron realizes that it's French policies that led to this rupture in relations with Mali, the better off we all will be. And I think that when he arrives in Washington this week, he should have a word with his supervisor, speaking of Mr. Biden, and he should tell Mr. Biden that present French-U.S. relations towards West Africa are due for a course correction, and certainly the satellite assets that AFRICOM, the Pentagon's Africa arm, are assisting France with, is only pouring gasoline on a raging fire and doing little to alleviate a major crisis.
And Dr. Horne, these French NGOs and the machinations that they involve themselves in, they sound an awful lot like American NGOs. Where they go, coups follow. And so to point to your point, to point the finger at this as being Russian propaganda, as though the people of Mali are just ignorant and can't see the reality that is their existence, is just more imperialist rhetoric, and it now seems to be falling upon deafer ears.
Well, it's also reflective of Mr. Macron's upcoming trip to Washington. Recall that it was not so long ago whenever Black people in Washington or Maryland or Virginia or the South began to protest, the Dixiecrats were charged that who was responsible? Outside agitators were responsible. Otherwise, the Black people would not have enough sense to revolt on their own. Mr. Macron has now said that the biggest outside agitator of them all with regard to West Africa happens to be Moscow. That particular line of attack did not work in the 1950s and 1960s during the struggle against Jim Crow. It will not work in the 21st century and the struggle against French neocolonialism and U.S. imperialism.
Let me just also quickly add, it also ignores the historic reality of Russia's anti-imperialist involvement in Angola and in other freedom struggles on the continent.
I don't know if you've seen the story, Dr. Horne, but there is an African midfielder, I believe, from Cameroon, who's getting a hard time because he has Russian flags on his cleats or whatever. And his argument was, I've been wearing them for years.
And he has dual citizenship. He started playing soccer in Russia,
right, exactly,
as a child.
Yeah, exactly. Your thoughts?
Well, I don't think that France nor the United States want to deal with reality. Neither one wants to deal with the reality that their exalted position, so-called today, mostly rests upon a cadaver, a mountain of cadavers of African bodies, exploited shamelessly and cruelly over the centuries. At the same time, you saw that Moscow, that is to say, even the predecessor state of the Soviet Union pre-1917, was assisting Ethiopia at the end of the 19th century and beating back Italian colonialists. You've already made reference to the Soviet experience in terms of helping to assist the Angolans against the Portuguese, the Mozambicans against the Portuguese, the South Africans against U.S. imperialism. And even though apparently the 80-year-old Mr. Biden has probably problems with memory, apparently that's not the case with this Cameroonian soccer player, nor the legions of Africans who are backing and supporting him.
An article in Al Jazeera, Ghana plans to buy oil with gold instead of dollars. The move is aimed at, according to this, at tackling dwindling forex reserves amidst rising inflation and a weakening local currency. But there could be other motives here. Your thoughts about this particular issue, Dr. Horne?
Well, I think we're all going to have to become familiar with the term de-dollarization. That is to say, led by China, you have numerous countries that are trying to move away from the dollar. Russia has been forced in the position because of sanctions, and so therefore it's selling many of its major resources, petroleum and natural gas in the first place, with regard to rubles or with regard to Indian rupees in the case of New Delhi. And I think that Ghana, obviously, the leadership reads the newspapers. They recognize that the greenback is headed for history's dustbin, and they don't want to be caught out in that process. And so, therefore, they're trying to switch to gold. Recall that Ghana was formerly known as the Gold Coast before independence in 1957, and that is a wise calculation on the part of the leadership in Accra.
There is a interesting piece in Mint Press: liberating Africa from poverty requires changing power relations with the West. This is a piece by Ramzi Bahrud, and his insight and analysis makes me think about the opposing malign Russian activities act in Africa, and how the United States now is trying to sanction African countries who are doing nothing but exercising sovereignty and turning towards resources that they deem to be operating in their best interest.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that odious legislation introduced by Congressional Black Caucus member Gregory Meeks of Southeast Queens, which seeks to punish African nations in particular who refuse to join the sanctions crusade against Moscow in light of the so-called special military operation in the Ukraine. That particular piece of legislation has been scorned by many African leaders. And by the way, after Mr. Macron leaves Washington, the next major foreign guest will be a number of heads of state and heads of government from Africa who are due in Washington shortly after Mr. Macron departs, as suggested. And I think that they will want to take Mr. Biden aside and have a word with him. And perhaps they will even meet with the Congressional Black Caucus and have a word with the CBC, because that legislation, I think, is going to complexify and complicate enormously relations between the United States and the African continent at a time when the United States is scrambling to find new sources of petroleum in light of the boycott of Russia. That helps to shed light on why they're trying to improve relations with Caracas, Venezuela, which has the most significant proven oil reserves on planet Earth. And so, once again, it seems that Washington is neatly complicating its relations with Africa. Perhaps they have not received the news that the era of colonialism ended some decades ago, whereas neocolonialism, the current model, is presently on the back foot.
Dr. Horne, it seems to me that a particular point in time was when the Queen died, the Queen of England died, and the discussion was unlike anything I've seen in the past when there were significant events involving the royal family. The conversation did actually kind of revolve around the colonial theft of natural resources from Africa. We've got about 2 minutes.
Well, sure. I mean, you know, of course, about the recent COP27 environmental crisis meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, where coming out of that meeting was this idea, to put it simply, of the global north paying a kind of reparations to the global south for the damage that the former has done to the environment, which is pulverized and penalizing the latter. It seems to me that that concept of reparations needs to be expanded. It needs to be expanded to apply to the descendants of enslaved Africans in North America. It needs to be expanded to all manner of human intercourse, because let's face it, the reason you have so much wealth in the so-called global north, the United States in the first place, is because of shameless exploitation of African bodies, the African slave trade in the first instance, and then, of course, even more similar exploitation of African natural resources.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. Greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.